Hi, and welcome to a very special At the Elliott today. I'm Jackie Williams for MCTV, and today I'm joined by a very special gentleman. This is Dr. Alan Baum. Dr. Baum, we're really happy to have you with us because you know more about cars than anybody I've ever met.
Thank you very much. I doubt it, but it sounds good.
Now, let's just tell everybody where we are and what you do here. We're at the Elliott Museum.
We're at the Elliott Museum. This is the car gallery, and it's a collection of 20 some odd cars that range in time from 1902 to 1986.
Okay.
They are typical of the early cars are in the beginning of the museum, where this one is the oldest, the Stanley Steamer of 1902, and this is a carriage with a steam engine on it. They put the steam engines towards the back where they were able to drive the wheels with chain drives. That's the way they did it. This car is famous for two things. One, it was the first car to climb Mount Washington in 1899, and it's also set the world speed record in 1906. It went at 127 miles an hour on Ormond Beach.
That is amazing. You told me that earlier, and that is amazing. Now, when it climbed Mount Washington, did it get a little sticker that said this car climbed Mount Washington?
They didn't exist in those days. The interesting thing, I've always said the feat was not getting to the top, was getting down in one piece with the brakes they had in those days.
Exactly. Now, this is a steam engine car.
Right.
And the reason we started here, and the reason that you and I are sitting in this car, is because this is steam, and the one next to us is electric.
It's electric.
And you wanted to make the point that we had steam cars and electric cars before we had.
Right. It wasn't until 1911 that the electric cars were outnumbered by the gasoline cars.
So up until
prior to that, there were more electric cars than gasoline cars.
Now, let me ask you a technical question. And I had mentioned to you earlier that I had spent a little bit of time on the internet today trying to get a history of the automobile. Was this steam engine and the electric engine, are they an internal combustion engine, or is that only a gas engine?
That's a gas engine.
Okay, so they're not internal.
Right.
How does a steam engine work? I don't see any wood.
And it has a boiler.
Okay.
And just as you can put in a grill, you can put charcoal, you can put wood, and so on. You can put anything in the boiler that burns. It can be gasoline, it can be wood, it can be charcoal, and
so
you control the fire.
Now, what did they burn in these engines?
The early ones mostly burned coal gas.
Okay.
And later on, they went to other fuels.
Okay, and if I were to drive this, how much coal gas would I have to put in to make it go how far?
You would have a tank that you would fill, and it would take you about a half hour to warm the car up so you could go. And of course, one of the problems, and it went out of existence, is because in wintertime that was even harder. So they gradually faded away. In the 1920s, they disappeared.
Now, I have to admit that it would have taken a half hour to warm up the car, but unlike today, we wouldn't be warmed up because we would be outside.
Very true.
Now, I don't see a steering wheel. How do we steer this?
A tiller.
Ah, so this turns the wheels.
Many of the early, even though the steering wheel was invented about 1895, it didn't become common in cars until much later. Most of the early cars you'll see have tillers to steer it. Okay. But, of course, the problem with a tiller is on a rutted road it's very difficult. Whereas a steering wheel you can hang on to.
Right.
A tiller is tough to control.
Now, explain to our viewers. You mentioned to me that there's the seat in front of us, and we're kind of sitting up. Now, who would have sit there?
That would be for the passengers, and they had a nice little footrest, so they were comfortable. But they faced the breeze, they faced the wind or anything else.
So they were our windshield,
So they
right?
were our windshield.
Okay. Now, you also, and I think this is fascinating, you also talked about how these early cars were really carriages
Almost all the cars that you see in the early days were made by carriage makers. There are some that were not, like Ford started without making a carriage. But almost the other ones were just carriages in which they put motors on, basically. In the early days, it was a steam or electric. Later on, it became a gasoline engine.
Now tell us a little bit about the Stanley Brothers, because Stanley Steamer, it is what even someone like me who grew up with, Corvettes and stuff.
Right. The Stanley Brothers were twins, born in Maine, and they settled in Massachusetts, in Waltham area. And when they saw the quadricycle invented by the Elliots, they decided they would put an engine on it. And they chose the most convenient one, which was a steam engine.
Okay.
And they also incidentally sold a drive film process to George Eastman, so they weren't just one-dimensional people.
They were pretty clever.
And then right now, if you went to the Stanley Hotel in Estes, Colorado, and you go there by train, they'll pick you up in the Stanley steamer and take you to the hotel. Yeah.
And do all of your cars run here?
They all run but two. One, the Bugatti, which has an incomplete engine in it, and we don't start this one because the boiler's under where I'm sitting, and I don't want to be blowing up, so we leave it alone.
Plus, it takes 20 minutes for it to warm up. Now, we're going to talk a minute about the electric car, but how far could I go in this car before I had to put more fuel in it?
Well, the fuel wouldn't be the problem, basically. It would be more the water. The reason being is you must have good water to put in the engine. Otherwise, it's going to clog up.
Oh.
So you could get fuel anywhere, but you can't get clean water. And that was one of the restrictions. A lot of people feel that it went out of existence because in the 19-teens, around 17 and 18, there was hoof and mouth disease in America. And they did away with horse troughs. And that's where they got their
so there's no place to get water
when they went on a trip. That's where they got most of their water. And so they claim that was the factory getting rid of them, but it was more than that.
Now, why, I'm sitting in this car, and to me it does feel like it feels a little bit like a stagecoach, but it actually went 127 miles an hour. Why?
Well, it was a little different design. They streamlined it a little bit to do it, but steam engines, you have to think of them the way you think of a locomotive. And when you think of a locomotive,
that's true.
And it starts out, it goes chug, 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 goes faster and faster. As long as you keep the throttle open, the train will go faster and faster and run off the tracks if you want to. But so the same is true of a car.
So this could
as long as they keep the throttle open, it's going to go faster. It was a question of nerve. What happened is after they set the speed limit, the next year they went back, and he reached 150 miles an hour, but the car started turning turtle and everything, so they quit before somebody got hurt.
Well, sitting up here with you, it is a matter of nerve if you're going to, I would think it's a matter of nerve if you're going to go 15 miles an hour in this.
I would believe that with, in certain weather, you'd be,
right.
You wouldn't be happy if it went 5 miles an hour.
Now tell us a little bit about the electric car.
Okay, that car is a Detroit Electric. That actually existed until about 1940. It's an electric car. It has six batteries in the front, 6 in the back. It has a top speed of 20 miles an hour, a range of 60 miles. And 60 miles.
60 miles.
That it was obvious that the only place you could use it would be in a major city where you could go shopping. And so if you lived in a big city, you saw these. I happen to live in Flushing, in the New York area, and one of my neighbors had one of these, so I saw this almost daily.
You did?
When I was younger, yes.
Well, you know what strikes me about it is the curvature of the windshield, and the fact that it looks like kind of a miniature, and I never really rode in one, but a miniature street car.
Sort of. It was, the thing about it is, where she's sitting, where the dummy is sitting, is where she drove the car. It was driven from the back seat.
Ah.
Now you could, if she was alone, she used the front seat. You know, she had a chauffeur. She used the front
Oh, I
seat.
see. There's two controls
There's
in
two
there.
controls. Yeah.
I
So
see.
she drove it from the back seat, and the seats are in a semicircle, so she could talk to her friends
Right.
as she drove along.
What a great idea. You're right. The seat in the front faces
Yeah.
the back.
So
So it's almost like a salon.
it's like a salon, and I don't think I ever saw one that there wasn't a flower in the flower vase in the front there.
I'll be darned.
And it was so popular that actually Mrs. Henry Ford drove one.
Is that right?
Yeah.
As opposed to a
As opposed to one of her own
Ford.
family cars.
Now,
Because all you did was turn a switch and go. You didn't have to crank the engine.
right, you didn't have to do that cranking thing. Now, it looks big to me. You know, when we think of our new hybrid cars, they're all kind of compact and small. But this thing looks big.
Well, I think that's the reason that the problem with electric cars is range. It's not
Right,
the car itself, it's the range. And people aren't content with going 30 miles from home and then 30 miles back. So you can't do it with electric cars. Thomas Alva Edison said in 1895 that you could never have an electric car. It
Because
just
you
wouldn't
couldn't
go
go far
far
enough.
enough. You can't go far enough. And he was right, but it has a very practical value if you're in a big city. Now, UPS delivered with electric trucks in New York City.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and a lot of people forget
Because they
that
could stay within a
they
certain...
could stay within a certain area, and that was very important. And the reliability of turning on an engine and going.
Sure,
and
and just
saying-
go.
And the other people that bought this car were physicians. And they did it when they made house calls, because again, they didn't have to crank the car. They just turned the
on
switch and away it went.
And is it basically like what we would call a golf cart? Does it run on
No,
batteries?
no,
or-
that runs on batteries, but this is a really, the important thing about this is you could go out in bad weather.
Okay.
You can't go out in bad weather in this car.
No.
But there you can go out in bad weather, and that's a big advantage.
Uh-huh.
And that was, I think, the reason it was so popular with women. It's because they could, they weren't worried about the wind in their hair
Right,
or anything
right.
else, so
Sure.
they were able to enjoy the ride.
Now, the one other thing that strikes me about this particular car is it has headlights that look like the lights that are on the outside of my garage door at home. It looks like home lights. Now, how did they light those headlights?
Turn the switch.
Oh, they ran on electricity
They ran
too.
electric.
And did they actually have a bulb in them?
Yeah.
So you had an electric
Yeah,
bulb
it was an
in
electric.
there.
It was all electric. There was no other source.
Okay, tell me again what year this car is.
That's 1914, I think.
Okay, so this is
Yeah.
1914.
But as I said, they lasted until 1940s.
Okay,
You could see
so you
them,
could
yeah,
still get
yeah.
these cars. Well, I have to admit that I'd sort of like to drive in that one because it looks really comfortable. The inside of it looks like it would be fun to drive.
It is. And as I say, I'm sure because they were only going 20 miles an hour, it wasn't much danger.
Right.
Although people forget that the top speed limit in many cities was 15.
Is that right? 15 miles an hour?
15 miles an hour. And you go by some schools today, what do they make you stop at 25?
Right,
So
right,
It's not
right.
It's not quite as ridiculous as it sounds
Right,
today.
right.
But it had
But still, to
Yeah,
us, 50
yeah.
miles an hour in the city is.
Yeah. And actually, the other thing, which is not important, but it did happen, the first person killed by an automobile was killed by an electric car
Oh, really?
because he couldn't hear it coming.
It didn't make any
Didn't
noise.
make any noise, and all the other cars were making noise.
Right.
So he got in the way of a car as it was going along.
Right. Now, would our Stanley steamer, in our cars today, we have exhaust because
Right.
of the internal combustion engine. But would steam be coming out of this?
In small amounts.
Okay,
yes,
so you
it
wouldn't-
is. One of the problems with the early steam engines, which is they didn't recycle water. Now all the steam engines recycle the water,
Mm-hmm.
so they don't need as much water as they did before. But in these days, they did not do that. That came much later.
And would this make a lot of noise?
Yes, you'd hear it.
Okay.
Yeah, you'd
Could
hear it.
we carry on a conversation, or would it be loud enough that...
I've never ridden in one, so I can't really answer that.
Well, it's fascinating to see some of these cars. And basically, these are kind of the first ones that were consumer-oriented.
Right. These are the ones. There's one thing about both this car and the one next to it. While they they're not the only electric car or the only steam car ever made. They represent the fact that these are the cars that were first used by most people.
Right.
These are the cars that they purchased early in the game.
Okay.
That were much more reliable than a gasoline car would be.
Now, before we're going to go take a look at some other cars, and we're going to talk about some cars that you told me actually represent the majority of the auto industry in our country. But before we do, I want our viewers to know just a little bit about you. You're 84 years old.
Right.
The reason you're interested in cars is because your dad was involved in the automobile industry. Tell us about that.
Well, he started, it's hard to believe, but he started before the turn of the century as an office boy in Brewster and Company.
Okay, and tell us who Brewster was.
That was the leading carriage maker in America. And what happened was William Brewster had no male children that were interested in the business. And for some reason, he took a fancy to my father, and he was like an apprentice for Brewster's. And he ended up in the late 1920s running Brewster and Company.
Okay.
For Brewster family. Yeah.
And as you told me, companies like Rolls-Royce would build a chassis.
Yeah. People forget that really, on through really even in the Depression, a lot of car companies just made the chassis. Rolls-Royce never made a complete car until I think after World War II. But what they did was they would make the chassis, and then they would send you to a carriage maker to have the body put on, so you could have any type you wanted, whatever it was. That was your problem. The same was true of an American one, which was made in Springfield, Massachusetts. They sent their chassis to Brewster and Company in Long Island City to have it made. Duesenbergs, which were made during the Depression, and they sold for between $18,000 and $28,000.
Wow.
They sent their people to carriage people to have their body put on.
Sure.
The Duesenbergs only made the chassis.
Right. So basically you could have whatever you wanted.
It gave you, in a sense, it made many of the cars, particularly the more expensive one, custom made. In that they just had the basic engine and all, and then you put in what you wanted. So.
Now, also tell everybody how you're a doctor, what kind of doctor you are.
Oh, I happen to be a radiologist.
Okay, tell us where you...
Mostly practiced on Long Island. We had built up a large practice. We had about 20 radiologists in the group, and we had offices all the way from Madison Avenue to Montauk Point. And I sort of, I was involved with Stony Brook, the medical school at Stony Brook.
Okay. Now, before we move on to our other cars, I'd also like you to tell our viewers who you had dinner with when you were a child.
Oh, I was telling you the story about Henry Ford coming to the house. And we had one rule in our house that the children sat there and they could not say anything until they were talked to. And so you listen to the conversations, and this particular one was between my father and Henry Ford, and they were arguing over brakes because my father was telling him, why don't you put a better brake on it? It's only $1 more a wheel. And Henry Ford was saying, when you're building millions of cars, that's important. So he said, they discussed it all night long, very, very gentlemanly, and no rants or anything like that. They just discussed it. That was it.
Sure. So your interest in these cars and your knowledge of early cars is something that is part of your life.
Yeah, I think part of it is also because I was alive in the 20s, so many of these cars that I look at, I've seen before.
Sure.
These are not new.
New to you, as some of them are to me.
Yeah.
Some of the ones that are like in the 1950s are not new to me. But, well, let's you and I kind of get out of our Stanley steamer here, and we'll go over and we'll take a look at some of these other cars.
Let me get out of here, and I hope you will. Out.
Doc and I are now sitting in an Oldsmobile. Now I know it doesn't look like the kind of Oldsmobile that we're used to, but this is actually an Oldsmobile, and I think, is it a 1905
This is a
Oldsmobile?
1905.
Okay.
Yeah, however, it was first designed in 1901, and it goes under the name of a curved dash Oldsmobile.
Curved dash,
Yes,
which
right.
means.
Yeah.
Now you had mentioned earlier when we were talking that in fact most automobiles were the bodies were built like carriages or sleighs.
They were built mostly by carriage makers, and so that they carried over into their design when they added engines, because the engines were basically only for the rear wheels.
Right. And this one is kind of designed like a sleigh.
Right.
And so a lot of cars were designed like sleighs.
I think the important thing of this one is that this was first designed in 1901, and it becomes therefore the oldest American automobile manufacturer in time. However, because they closed down Oldsmobile last year, it no longer is considered that,
Right.
and I think Ford now has the
It's
Ford or
ongoing.
Cadillac would have it,
Right.
because they started then.
Now, there is what to me was a fascinating story about Oldsmobile and Cadillac. And as a matter of fact, where we're sitting, there are 5 cars in a row here. And as you pointed out earlier, these 5 cars actually represent the historical significance of the United States automobile industry. Tell this story about Oldsmobile.
I'll start with Oldsmobile because, as I said, that was the first. And what happened was his father owned a motor shop,
Now, his name was Olds.
Olds.
Okay.
And he purchased the shop from his father and then started to tinker with engines, gasoline, steam, electric, and he finally settled on a gasoline engine. He then finally raised money and was able to build a factory in Detroit. The day before they were opened their doors, the factory burned to the ground. And they rescued one car, which they called the Curved Dash car.
And that
which
was
is
basically this car.
For some reason that's never been explained, it became very popular in America. And even the first year, they got orders for about 445 cars,
Now,
which
that's
was unheard
amazing.
of in those days.
And as you said before, here's a man who has to build these cars one at a time, and he's got to build 445 of them or whatever.
And so he decided what he would do was he would outsource some of his material, and he took his engine and he outsourced that to a man named Henry Leland, who was a mechanic, and had a famous business called Leland and Faulkner. And he asked him to make the engine. He then went to the Dodge Brothers and asked him to make parts for the car.
Now, these are all
And-
famous names
right.
that we know about from automobiles.
And then what he did was he set up a primitive assembly line in his new factory and assembled them from the outsourced products. Henry Leland took his engine and improved on it and went back to Olds and said, "Would you like a better engine?" And Olds said, "No, just build my engine and that's it." And so Henry Leland turned around and went up the street to what was then Cadillac and sold the engine to them. And that was the start of the Cadillac. And he took over as head of Cadillac. What had happened before that was Henry Ford, the original company was a Henry Ford
The
company.
Cadillac company was.
And Henry Ford walked away after an argument with the board of directors. Unlike Olds, he took his name with him. And so it was a nameless corporation, and they named it after the founder of the city of Detroit, a Frenchman named Cadillac.
That is fascinating. I didn't know that that's what Cadillac was.
That's where it comes from.
Okay.
And Henry Leland took over Cadillac. And he's responsible for the technique of cars where everything has to be the same, it has to be to specifications, and therefore the cars can easily be, parts can be replaced. And he's the one responsible for that.
Now, you said you
He
told me a
also-
story about that.
Yeah. He also is responsible, incidentally, for electric starting.
Ah.
He got Kittering, who worked for National Cash Register, to develop a starter for his cars. And the patent was issued in 1911, and Cadillac of 1912 was the first car to have electric starting.
Oh my heavens.
It's of interest to note that if you had purchased a Ford in 1934, you still had to turn the crank. they still did.
Now I was going to ask you about that. Would this car have started with a crank?
Yeah.
And would the crank be in the front?
No, the crank's right here.
Ah, okay. Now we were talking a little earlier too. This car has a clutch and a shift,
Right.
and the shift is on the side.
Right.
Okay, and you have to put the clutch in just
Yeah.
like a standard transmission today.
And it has a horn.
I love the horn. The horn is great. Now you told me earlier a story about the Cadillacs and how Mr. Leland took 3 Cadillacs.
Oh yeah. There was a prize given to the automobile industry, and it's called the Dewar Prize, D-E-W-A-R, and it was given by an English, probably the Scotch company.
I was going to say, Dewar's
probably
pretty famous
probably
Scotch.
the Scotch company. Anyway, he took 3 Cadillacs, and he took them completely apart, threw the 3 parts in a heap in the middle of a room, had them reassembled, and the cars started immediately.
So parts from each car
showing that every
interchangeable.
car, and he won the prize for that.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Pretty cool. Now, we're sitting in an Oldsmobile. Mr. Olds left, and the name of the company stayed.
Ford got mad at his board of directors and left in 1902.
Okay.
He then started the Ford automobile company we know of as today. Olds got mad at his board of directors, and he walked away in 1904. When he walked away, Maxwell, who
Okay.
worked for him,
And Maxwell's one of the
started-
pageants over there,
yeah,
the yellow
started
one.
that car, which is the Maxwell car. 4 engineers left and formed the Hudson car company. Olds left and formed the Rio company, which was
This
the
one right here.
thing. And so, if you trace it back between what Ford did
Over there with the
over
Cadillac.
there, they all are have a common bond between
Sure,
them all.
sure.
They-
And to me, the thing that was fascinating was Mr. Olds, who really started this whole thing, went and designed the Rio, and we don't even know about the Rio, but we know about the Oldsmobile, which he actually walked away from.
He walked away from it.
That's amazing.
And the Rio lasted until the 1930s, but it they started specializing in trucks. Mm-hmm. And so they persisted as trucks into the 1970s.
Now, all of these cars, we talked about these 5 cars, this
Yeah.
one, and that one, and then the Ford over there. Were they all in Detroit? We think of Detroit as the center of the car universe.
When you talk being in Detroit, you have to remember that they would set up factories other places beside Detroit. It wasn't just in Detroit. Now, Olds started in Detroit. The factory burned to the ground.
Went to
Lansing, Michigan came along and offered him a factory for nothing. So he moved his business to Lansing, Michigan.
Kind of the first incentive
Right.
program to bring industry.
Now Ford, when he left what became Cadillac, he stayed in Detroit. Of course, he then went elsewhere too, but
Sure.
he stayed in Detroit. Rio stayed in Detroit.
Did these guys all know each other?
Obviously, Olds knew Maxwell, Chalmers. Trying to think of who else. Leland, he knew Leland well.
Did he know Ford?
He knew Ford, but more by not as a personal friend. As far as I know, they were friends. But they all. It's interesting because they all were in the same area. They were in the Midwest. They really worked out of the same area, and yet they didn't steal from one another that much. It wasn't as if they were stealing your ideas and,
Right.
and designing your car. They were going off in their own direction. And the same is true of Benz and Daimler. They actually live 60 miles apart
Now these are
in Germany.
the German industry.
And they never even knew each other
Is
in
that
the
right?
beginning. And actually, Daimler didn't join with Benz until 1926. So it isn't as if, again, they were competing, but they didn't compete.
Right, right. Now, you also mentioned earlier that during this time period, early 1900s into the teens, part of the 20th century, that was it 1 in 45 families owned a car?
And when Henry Ford started the Model T in 1908, there was one car for every 45 families.
One car for every 45 families.
When he finished in 1928, there was one car for every 1.3 families. It revolutionized the whole of American society.
Right.
And it really influenced the world because also for the same reason.
Right. Now, and I said to you that I would have thought there would be less than one car for every 45 families, but you pointed out.
It was not uncommon for the wealthy people to, I think it was John Jacob Astor that had 26 cars in his garage. I mean,
that counted.
That counted.
Right, one of his cars counted for my family, right?
I guess so. But it was, the wealthy people just kept collecting cars.
Right. But in 1928,
you take an example of that. I can tell you, the Hupmobile down there, that was the first car that Harmon Elliott owned.
Uh-huh.
That Stanley Steamer is the first car that Sterling Elliott owned.
Okay.
So they preserved it, and
Right.
it's in the museum.
Right,
And
right.
Harmon Elliott preserved his, and it's in the museum.
Sure.
So, they did hang on to their cars.
Yeah. Now, by 1928, it was one almost for every family.
Yeah, pretty close.
And that changed everything we did.
Sure, you didn't have to live next to you didn't have to live next to the factory. You could visit your friends, you could travel. It also was responsible, there were so many cars, that roads had to be built. So we had to build the highways. It was and after World War I, there was a tremendous boom in building highways.
Sure, because more and more people were getting cars.
They had cars and they had to get there. There was a person that wanted to go from New York to Jamestown in Virginia. They were celebrating their, whatever it was at that time, 100th anniversry or whatever it was.
Oh, right,
anyway,
from Jamestown?
Yeah, from Jamestown. It took them 3.5 days to get from New York to Jamestown. I mean, we don't think of it in those terms today, but they travel. 4
because
women,
of the roads.
Yeah, 4 women got in a Maxwell in 1909, and they drove from New York to San Francisco, 59 days, practically no roads west of the Mississippi. When they got to a bridge, when they got to a river without a bridge, they went over on the railroad tracks because, of course, they had the Transcontinental Railroad.
Oh, gee.
They went over on the railroad tracks.
59 days it took?
59 days to go from New York to San Francisco.
So that when cars became popular, we started to build the roads that we could
travel,
put them on.
And we challenged the country. We really did. We just had to go everywhere.
Yeah.
And so it's as they say, the advent of and the Model T became it started out at $850 in 1908.
$850.
And it was $250 in 1928.
Oh my heavens! So it actually went down.
So it went down, and so it was it was easy to own a car.
Sure.
And as I said, in 1905, Ford gave his employees a $1,000 bonus on Christmas, 1905. That represented more than they earned for a year.
Sure.
The average salary was $870 a year in those days.
They could then buy a Ford.
They could then afford a Ford.
And you mentioned
which may have been his idea.
Right. And you mentioned the other auto manufacturers weren't too happy about that bonus.
They did not enjoy that.
Now, how many cars are in the collection?
I think there's 25 or 26, something like that.
And
I'd have to count them again. The reason I have to count them is they move in and out.
Right.
We 2 of them were taken out last week.
Okay.
And so then, I have to keep counting.
And of those 25 or 26 cars, which is your favorite?
I probably, if I had to make a decision, I would probably go with the 190 SL. The reason Mercedes, the reason I say that because I own one, way back. And so, you know, it's kind of, it brings back memories.
It has a sentimental
Right.
appeal to
Yeah,
you.
yeah. And so I think that's it. The other one that I kind of enjoy is the Packard. The reason I enjoy the Packard is it represents cars that I remember as a child. I was one of 8, so we had to have a big car, and people forget how big families were, and there was one car to the whole family.
Right.
There wasn't a car
Right.
for every child, so that I kind of, it brings back memories to see a big car like that with jump seats, because I remember jump seats when I was
Now, is a jump seat the same as a rumble seat?
No, jump seat there are 3 varieties. They're collapsible seats that come out of the front seat and face forward.
Like in a limousine.
There are ones that come out of the front seat and face backwards. And then they have ones that are just freestanding in the between the front and the back seat. And there are 3 different types. They incidentally were not just in cars. They existed in carriages.
Carriages
before that. Yeah.
Now, I think the car that's directly across from us that our viewers can't see right now, but I think that has a rumble seat in it. Is that
does.
a rumble seat?
That's a rumble seat.
Now that is really cool.
Well, that car is a 1930 Model A. That's the car that, you know, when I was in college in the 30s, that you could purchase for somewhere between $25 and $75, and I kid you not.
$25 and $75. Even I could afford that.
That's what the college kids drove.
Now that's a Model A?
That's a Model A. It's a rumble seat. Wonderful, a lot of fun, except when it's raining or cold. There's no heat in the rumble seat. And it was if it was raining, you never could get dry. It was a lot of fun. The only thing you really needed as a spare part was a fan belt. That's the only one that ever broke. Anything broke with it.
It's really cool, and you know what I'd like is, I know that the Elliott Museum sometimes brings their cars to parades.
Right, they do it a lot. They sent out these 2 just this week for the parade.
I was going to say, you know, some parade. Could you and I drive in the in the Model A Ford, and we'll can you put the top down?
I don't know whether they want you to do that. That might be a little risky.
But that's really a cool car.
Might get it down, but it may not get it up again.
Is there one car in the group here that is really famous?
Fame in cars are difficult to thing. Now we'll take the Corvette over there. That's a 1954 Corvette. The first 2 years, 1953 and 54, were failures. And they didn't make any that much. In 55, they weren't selling well at all, so they redid the whole car completely, and that's when they caught on. But because so few were made of that might be more valuable than one that was in a good year. So you can't think. Everybody that asks me about what's the value of a car, I give them the same answer, and that is, what's the Mona Lisa worth? It's what somebody wants to pay for it.
Right.
And that's the value of anything that we have in this museum.
Right.
And if there's somebody that wants it, it has real value.
Well, I got to tell you, your value is in your stories, because the stories are great, and we want to thank you for spending this time with us. I learned a heck of a lot about the history of cars from you, and we really appreciate it. Maybe we'll come back and do it again. What about that?
Anytime you want to.
Well, we appreciate your time, and we thank you for being with us and joining us on MCTV.
Thank you.